So, another giant crossover event has come and gone, which means we comic book fans finally have a moment to breathe. We can finally relax because that means it's going to be a full year until the next one starts, and, okay, maybe not a year, maybe more like 6 months. Okay, 2 months. Okay, -1 month. Marvel, we need to talk. Okay, listen, there was a time when the big events over at Marvel were a rarity. The idea of these heroes crossing over and actually encountering each other was the exception, not the norm. And honestly, as someone who grew up in that time, yeah, I had a problem with it. I wanted to see these characters actually meet each other from time to time rather than feeling like characters in their own separate realities. Well, as the old saying goes, be careful what you wish for. Curse you, Magic Monkey Paw, you've screwed me for the last time. Because a little over 10 years ago, when Brian Michael Bendis took over the Avengers, he kicked it off with an epic event that promised to change the Marvel Universe forever, and boy did it, but not for the reasons that he thought. Yes, the event was Avengers Disassembled, in which the Avengers were disbanded after one of their own members went crazy. They of course got back together shortly afterwards, but the team was very different, and the whole structure of this team was forever changed. The mansion was gone, the focus on more obscure heroes went out the window, and honestly, the feeling of the Avengers just being a family no longer existed. It now felt like a bunch of heroes who teamed up rather than a group that had grown and bonded over the course of years. And that's a rant for another day, but Avengers Disassembled also changed the Marvel Universe in a way that wasn't reflected on the page. Because you see, this was all just a setup for House of M, the next big event. And honestly, okay. I was fine with that because after the ending of Avengers Disassembled, it made sense to have a storyline dealing with the Scarlet Witch and where her story would go and the fallout from this event. But then this led into Decimation, the fallout from this event. But again, that made sense. After the end of House of M, it would only make sense to see how it would affect the X-Men, and the storyline was only limited to the X-Men books, like how Avengers Disassembled was only limited to the Avengers books. But then there came Civil War, and this event truly crossed over into everything. This was incredible. Nothing had happened quite like this since Onslaught. It was a truly epic event. It felt mind-blowing. It felt special. And then a year later, World War Hulk came. But okay, that had been building up for a year, so cool. I'm fine with that. But then a year later we had Secret Invasion, and yes, they had been building up to this as well, but now it was starting to feel like we were being overwhelmed with these events, and this one came in and completely dismantled everything that Civil War had built up, so it kind of took away the impact of that event. And then a year after that we got Siege, which undid Secret Invasion, but Siege felt like the end. It felt like they were coming in and saying, hey guys, this is the end of a long string of us doing massive crossover events. Now we can get back to normal. So you know what? I was okay with it ending there. But it didn't end there. Like I said, Siege felt like things had come full circles. The Avengers were back, the Registration Act was over, it felt like those giant crossover events finally had a period mark. But turns out there was another period mark. And another one. And then the words "to be continued," because then bam, Fear itself exploded onto the stage and nobody cared. Like I said, all the previous giant Marvel events had a build-up. They had long storylines that led into them, or they flowed from one event into the next. But when Siege finally just settled everything, it was like Marvel went, oh shoot, we forgot to set up the next event. It was like Marvel packed up all their summer break equipment and then remembered, oh right, I've got one more exam I didn't study for due tomorrow. This event came out of nowhere and changed things that didn't need changing. People were digging Bucky as Cap and Steve as the head of S.H.I.E.L.D. It felt like a solid progression of these characters, but Marvel needed an event, and an event has to change everything. So yeah, Avengers Disassembled and House of M and Civil War, this was the start of Marvel's string of crossover events, but Fear itself was the start of the screw it, let's just have an event phase. Avengers vs. X-Men, Age of Ultron, Infinity, Original Sin, Axis, Secret Wars, Civil War II, Inhumans vs. X-Men, Monsters Unleashed. These giant crossover events used to happen once a year at the most. All those events I just listed came out in the last 4 years. That's almost triple what the maximum used to be. At that point, it just feels like getting hammered over the head with these, especially when so many of them follow the exact same formula. You want to play a fun game? Take a look back at that list I just gave you. How many of those events involved heroes fighting other heroes or a hero turning out to be the secret villain? And that's just the big events that crossed into everything. I'm not even including the smaller crossover events that just crossed over into a certain corner of the Marvel Universe. In the past 3 years, we've also had Battle of the Atom, Trial of Jean Grey, Revolution War, Death of Wolverine, Spider-Verse, Black Vortex, Standoff, Death of X, and Dead No More, The Clone Conspiracy. And yes, I know that Marvel used to have plenty of smaller crossovers like this that would cross over into lots of series, but they didn't change everything. Atlantis Attacks didn't change the entire Marvel Universe for the next year. Acts of Vengeance was just a fun excuse for heroes to fight different villains. It didn't change these characters forever, but now everything is changing constantly, and it's changing way too fast. And don't get me wrong, characters should change. They should grow and develop. It's not good to be stagnant. It's not good to just toe the line, but that's not the type of change we're seeing. This is big change constantly happening in a way that just completely upheaves everything that we'd been reading and ends it. That's become the norm, and when change becomes the norm, it stops being special. And if I know that everything I've been reading will just be flipped on its side in a few months, then it keeps me from forming any attachment. And when you have a book that you can't get an attachment to, then what's the point? Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Look at Iron Man. A few years ago, we learned that Tony Stark had actually been adopted and he never knew his birth parents. And after a year of searching, he finally found his birth mother. This is a good type of change. It takes something that we could understand happening to this character, and over a period of time, it gets the character to a point where his life is changed, and it sets up for numerous new storylines to tell with this character. Tony finding his mother? Wow. That's emotional and touching. I wonder what the two of them will have to talk about. I wonder how this change will affect Tony's life. I wonder what we'll see from Tony and his new mother. Answer? Nothing! Because literally 1 issue later, Tony died in Civil War II. And yes, I know he didn't actually die, but for all intents and purposes, he's basically DOA at the moment. But that's not the point. The point is, this is an example of bad change. Tony's story had not been leading up to Civil War II. It was just something that came in out of nowhere, and it stopped any possible new storylines that could have come from Tony now finding his mother. Or what about the situation between Pepper and Tony? The two of them had split ways and never got reconnected. Any development we could have gotten from the two of them, gone because Tony is now dead. But we have a new Iron Man now, and hey, listen. I fully understand the importance of Riri Williams. I know how much it means to have a young black woman in the role of a major superhero, and I think that's great. It's an example of positive change, but the way that they went about introducing her was another example of bad change. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Riri Williams was introduced just a few issues before the Civil War II storyline where Tony died, meaning that rather than letting us get to know her, rather than building her up as her own character, rather than establishing a connection between her and Tony, they kind of just said, "You're up, kid," and threw her into the middle of all of this. If they had given us just another year for her and Tony to form a bond, that would have been great. But instead, they had to introduce her and get her to meet Tony in the same storyline where they had some psychic inhuman putting people in jail and Tony dying while not resolving any of his own storylines. It takes away from both these characters when you have to merge the introduction of a new character with the death of an old one. It doesn't feel natural. It feels like someone at Marvel just said, "Time to change Iron Man." And another example of this is when Thor lost his hammer because suddenly he wasn't worthy anymore. Now, let me just say that I love the new Thor. I want her to stick around. Both of her series have been amazing, and the new Thor is Jane Foster, a character who has a long history with Thor, and over the past few years, writer Jason Aaron has crafted a storyline around her that would put her in a great spot to become the new Thor. So Jane Foster becoming the new Thor is an example of good change. However, the old Thor losing his hammer, that's an example of bad change because nothing in his series set up that was going to happen. Instead, it just happened in a crossover event. In Original Sin, an event that didn't even focus on Thor. It didn't have anything to do with him. When Nick Fury just whispered something in his ear and then out of nowhere, bam, he's not worthy anymore, that was it? This is a huge deal. This is something you need to lead up to. This is something that deserves its own storyline. This is something that needs to be the central focus of an event, not a side effect of it. And by the way, going back to Civil War II, I've been putting up quotation marks around every time I refer to Tony being dead because he's not really dead. He's in a coma because Marvel wanted to turn and wink at us and let us know he's coming back. Oh, well then never mind. This isn't bad change, this is worst. It's fake change. You came in, ended storylines before they could start, prevented characters from getting the development that they deserved, and it was for nothing. You're not even going to pretend like there was a lasting effect, so then why do it at all? It's because Marvel has had such success with their previous crossover events that they can't stop themselves. They've become addicted to it. And like with any addict, there comes a moment when they hit rock bottom. And honestly, I think this point right now, when they have 3 giant crossover events all happening within a few months of each other, this is it. Marvel has come to believe that if they don't have a massive crossover event, then they're going to lose money because the big events always sell. And they love to come in here and say, hey, if you don't want us to do giant crossover events, then stop buying these books. But this is a flawed way of thinking for multiple reasons. First reason is because you tell us everything is going to change forever. Well then how on earth are we supposed to not pick these books up? We like the way things are. Now you're going to wreck it? It's like telling us that you're going to move all the furniture around in our house. There's no way to stop you from doing it. We can either watch you do it so we know where everything goes, or we can just stumble home and try and figure it out in the dark. And that's what I find so obscene about this. You're using our love for these books and our love for these characters to basically force us to read these crossover events. When you actually advertise a book like Civil War issue number 3 by telling us a major character will kill another major character, knowing full well we love these characters, that's basically like holding a gun to these characters' heads and saying, fork over the $5 if you want to know if this guy lives or dies. You can tell us to vote with our dollars, but these characters are important to us. It's hard to vote against learning what awful thing you're going to do to them next. And I love to tell people, don't read it, just find out what happens to them online. But at the same time, I understand there's a difference between hearing what happens to them and reading about. When you read it, you're there in that moment. You get the context. You see everything unfold. And even if you hate it, when you care about these characters, you'd rather be there when one of them dies than just hear about it secondhand. And secondly, this idea that giant events crossing over into other series will increase their sales is a fairy tale. It doesn't work. It never worked. Yes, there is an audience out there who does indeed love these big events. I know I've been talking like we all hate them together, but I have seen that audience that can't wait for the next big event, and no matter what it is, they're going to come in and buy all the titles that cross over into it, even if they don't actually have anything to do with the main story itself. So you'd think, great, they're going to buy these issues in addition to all the regular readers who were already reading them. Jackpot! 1 + 1 = 2, baby! But yeah, take it from a guy who works in a store and actually sees how these numbers play out. As I said, there is indeed an audience that will buy anything with a crossover banner on it. But there's also that audience out there that hates crossover events, that refuses to read any issues of a series that crosses into them, and many of these readers have books that they follow the stories to and want to see where these stories go, and there's nothing they hate more than to see these stories being interrupted by some big event that they don't care about. I saw so many readers at my store skip the books they had been reading when they crossed into Civil War II because they didn't care about Civil War II, or they were afraid that they wouldn't be able to follow the crossover issues since they weren't reading the main event, which basically negated all the readers who picked it up just for the crossover. But here's the thing, when those books stopped crossing over into Civil War II, the Rubbernecker fans, the ones who just picked it up to see how it crossed over into this event, they stopped reading it because it no longer connected to the event, and that's the only reason that they were picking it up. But the old fans who dropped the book, not all of them came back. Some of them lost interest with it because of the crossover, and they didn't bother to return. That's right, you heard me. Take it from someone who has seen this with their own two eyes. Crossover events do not cause book sales to go up in the long run. They actually cause them to drop. So as I said, I understand that there is an audience out there and they just want to read big events. They want to see all these heroes crossing over and punching stuff together. But interrupting series and having to stop or alter their stories so that you can cross over into these big events isn't the way to go about this. It doesn't help. It doesn't get new readers onto the books, and it doesn't save struggling books. Seriously, name me one book in the past 10 years that had low sales, then went up after it crossed into an event. I'll wait. Yeah, can't think of one. Because it hasn't happened. It doesn't grow new audiences. It just loses the old ones. So Marvel, I know that I've been arguing with you pretty heavily, but I want to extend the olive branch. I want to negotiate. I've come to bargain. As I said, I get that there's an audience out there that loves these big massive events that change everything, but actually changing everything is not the answer to how to tell better stories, and as I said, crossing these stories over is not always the way to help your sales. So how about this? How about instead of doing massive events that cross into everything and changes the end of stories that we've been following, how about you do more stories like the current Monsters Unleashed event? This current storyline is all about, well, giant monsters attacking the Earth and the heroes have to stop them. Pretty simple, easy to understand. Nobody is going to have their stories end or be interrupted by this event, but at the same time, you might introduce some new characters, start some new plot lines that we can follow, which technically, I guess, means that you will still be able to wink and nod and say that you're changing everything, so all the crossover event junkies will still race out to pick this up. But because it's not really interrupting any stories and the only issues it's crossing into are side story one-shots that have no impact on the regular series, we, the rest of the comic book reading audience who just want to keep reading these titles and following these stories, are untouched. We're fine. Or, if you really want to do a massive event, then it's time that you do the unthinkable. It's time that you look at DC. Yes, I said that Marvel has had too many crossover events just popping up out of nowhere with no build-up, and there's been massive impacts on characters that interrupted their stories rather than building upon them and allowing them to grow, and they're causing the universe to move so quickly that we can't even get an attachment to any of these new characters because you just put them out there. But let's look at how DC has done crossover events. A few years ago, they had a storyline where the Crime Syndicate, an evil version of the Justice League from a backwards dimension, jumped into our universe. In that storyline, we got introduced to Power Ring, the evil version of Green Lantern, who sought out Host, who felt great fear to take them over and corrupt them. When that storyline ended, Power Ring possessed a new character, Jessica Cruz, a woman who suffered from crippling anxiety, so much so that she couldn't even bring herself to leave her apartment. But the Justice League found her and introduced her to Barry Allen and Hal Jordan, who decide to train her using the power ring for good, to try and teach her to overcome her fears. This then led into another large event, the Dark Side War, in which many giant revelations came about, but they were all things that had been hinted at and built upon over the course of the last 50 issues of the Justice League. It made major changes to the history of Wonder Woman, but Wonder Woman was the protagonist of this entire storyline. She was the one narrating it all and telling it from her point of view, so this giant change to her history wasn't a side effect of the event, it was something the entire event was leading up to. And during this event, Jessica Cruz had to finally face the evil inside of Power Ring. She had to confront her fears, something her own storyline had been building towards over a year. And when she finally was able to overcome her fears, the Power Ring vanished and she received a Green Lantern ring as her reward for showing that she could overcome great fear, making her the next character in the legacy of one of DC's biggest heroes. Did you see all that? These events all flowed from one to the next. They weren't just randomly popping up to interrupt character storylines. They built from one storyline to the next. They took time off in between them to show you the consequences of the last story and to show you how they could lead into the next storyline. The plot points of this event actually reflected what had come before in the series and called back to it. And the massive changes didn't just happen to characters in the story, we actually got to see these characters building up to these changes, and we got to see how it affected them. And if you wanted to get a better sense of how these characters were affected by all this, they had side story one-shots that actually explored that. And Jessica Cruz didn't have her origin forced into the middle of one of these events. No, she had time to be introduced. We got time to know her, and we had time to watch her connect with the League and watch her grow. And when she changed forever, it felt earned. It felt like this had all been building up to that moment, and it made perfect sense. So no, I'm not saying stop with the giant events. Just take time to breathe in between them. Take time to plan things out. Take time to build up the stories that you need to tell, and take time to figure out how this will affect everyone. And for God's sakes, stop forcing these events where they don't need to be. Let the crossover fans have their crossover, but let the regular comic readers have their stories that they want. There's a right way to do giant crossover events, Marvel, and there's a wrong way. All I'm asking is that you stop and ask yourself, are we doing this the right way? And just to finish this off by giving you guys a compliment, I will say, with Secret Empire, you've been building that up for almost 2 years now. So this is indeed a story that has taken its time. I think it has some hope of being a great event. But after it's done, just do me a favor and take some time off from the events, okay? Okay, you can have one more. But after that, can we take a break? Oh, come on! But that's just my opinion. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Do you like these giant events? Are you getting sick of them? What lessons do you think Marvel needs to learn? What was your favorite crossover event? Let me know all that and more down below. That's it for today's EdiThorgials. We do opinion pieces like this on everything from the world of geekery, whether it be comics, video games, movies, anything like that. We also do reviews, top 10s, lots of other fun stuff, so make sure that you hit that subscribe button, and also follow me on Twitter and Tumblr at Professor Thorgy. And if you like these videos, then make sure that you share them around the web. It's the best way to help this channel grow. Thanks everyone, come back next time.